It didn't seem like much at the time. He was just standing at his workbench when his right knee had come out from under him. He had sort of rolled down to the floor, but then he stood up, dusted himself off, and went back to work. He forgot all about that odd fall until about 2 weeks later when it happened again. But this time it hurt. A deep pain that cut straight to the bone. So he propped his leg up on a pillow and spent the afternoon letting it cool off. 3 days later, he had another episode. This time, the pain radiated out into the muscles of his hips and lower back. So he went to his doctor, and the physician was perplexed. "You know," he said, "you are too young for me to think that this is arthritis. You are too active for this to be a blood clot. I just don't know what it is. Sometimes these things are idiopathic. They come on, we don't have any explanation, and they go away as soon as they came. And we never know what caused them." Now, I can refer you to a specialist, but really, you'll just be paying for his kid's braces. I suggest you go home, rest a little bit, and call me if it keeps happening. So that's what he did. He learned to ignore the pain that wouldn't go away some days and learned on other days simply to work through it. He began resting his weight on his good leg and favoring the bad one, but then the good leg started to hurt too. That was when his mother really got worried about him and encouraged him to go and see the specialist anyway, but he resisted. "It's a waste of time and money, Mom. Besides, I can still work. They won't be able to tell me anything that our doctor here in Jerusalem can't tell us." Years later, he still remembered the way that the light progressed across the floor from the window above while he waited for someone to come home and help him up off the floor. He had woken up, and for the first day in a while, he realized he didn't hurt. As he started to roll out of bed, he realized his legs weren't doing anything, and he just rolled right on out into the floor. That was when he realized he didn't feel anything. Nothing, no pain, nothing. From the chest to the tips of his toes. So he struggled a few times mightily to make his way to his feet, only to crumble back to the floor. Time and time he did it until he was too exhausted even to drag himself back into his own bed. That afternoon, his parents put their feet down. His father took him back to the doctor, and he waited patiently as the doctor pricked the end of each one of his toes with pins, seeking to find any evidence of feeling. Nothing. And then the physician said, "Well, there's really nothing I can do. I'm a GP, after all. You need someone who specializes in paralysis, and there's nobody in Jerusalem who deals with this particular sort of disease." Now, I have heard through the grapevine that there are some folks in Rome who specialize in your kind of paralysis. But let me tell you, I can't see any physical reason for your ailment. I think you need a priest, not a physician. Young man, have you been living right? Home again, but now he couldn't work. He couldn't even drag himself up and down the stairs, and after a few months, they realized his wedding would have to be postponed. Well, they called it a postponement at least. After a year, his fiancée sent her uncle to meet with his uncle, and they reached an agreement. He heard later the conversation went like this: surely his family couldn't expect her to tie herself down to someone who had no means of supporting her. His illness showed that he was not living right, so would they kindly just return the dowry? No hard feelings. We'll never mention it again. When he heard that, that's when he started to feel washed up and not even 20 years old. The days stretched on. With nothing to do, sleep became elusive. He found ways to pass the time for a while, but let's be honest, there is only so much solitaire you can play before it doesn't even pass the time anymore. It was the empty time that depressed him the most. It was then that he heard about the pool at Bethzatha. He heard that some folks had been healed there. Friends told him that when the angel came and stirred the water, the first person in could expect miraculous healing as the spiritual woes that led to the physical ills floated away in the bubbling pool. First he resisted. That was for other people. But as the days wore on, he asked finally to be carried down to the waterfront. He knew that it would be a hassle for his family to carry him there and back every morning, but he comforted himself in the knowledge that really he would do it for them. 38 years went by. They settled into a routine, 38 years of waiting by the water's edge, 38 years of the smells of death and sickness every day. For 38 years, he watched his fellow sufferers come and go. Some died, some just gave up hope. 38 years of waiting by the water's edge. He became an old man lying beside that pool. His muscles withered away. His legs and hips were just skin on bone these days. One time he thought he had succeeded in getting into the pool while the water was being stirred, the first one in, but it turned out that it was just the wind stirring the water. He didn't know that until after he'd rolled off the edge into the pool, plunging into the cold water in hopes only to realize that the cold water was being dashed on his hopes, not on his illness. They had laughed that time, and he decided it was better just to laugh along and pretend he was in on the joke. You see, there was no method, no order to how people got into the pool. Nobody waited for the person who needed it the most to be the first one in. It was a mockery of those who really needed a cure when some jerk pushed past, probably with only a hangnail, thinking, I'm going to get mine, cannonballing into the water and soaking everyone in a 10-foot radius, and then jumping up and declaring, I'm healed. Nobody who needed healing ever laughed at that joke. Because those who really needed healing could never get there. They could never be the first ones into the pool. It really was caustic, the way that those who were already adequate, those who already had the means they needed to get well, jumped in the pool, and it held its treasure elusively from those who needed it the most. It was like grace held just beyond the reach of their fingertips, wholeness just out of reach to them. To the lepers who came seeking cleanness, to the blind who wanted to see, to the women made unclean by hemorrhages, to the deaf who wanted to hear, and the mute who wanted to speak, and to him who just wanted to get on with his life. He passed his life by the water's edge, waiting for mercy that was always just out of reach. On that Friday afternoon, he noticed with a sinking heart that the sun was setting and his brother had not yet come to carry him home on his back. The setting of the sun, of course, brought the Sabbath, and that meant that he would spend the night and then the next day there waiting for the Sabbath to be over. It was forbidden to work on the Sabbath. His brother could not come and carry him. That would be work. No one could carry a meal to him. That would be work. And work was strictly prohibited on the Sabbath. The law was clear in what it commanded. You know the words, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Only after dark the next day could his brother walk down to the pool and carry him home. And to make matters worse, it was a festival day, which meant the place would be overrun with tourists whose feet would kick up the dust so that it would cloud his vision and fill his mouth, and no one could carry him any water to wipe off the dust because that too would be work. And the law forbade it. It was almost the end of the day when he heard the question from behind him, "Do you want to be made well?" He paused, bit his tongue, fighting back the sarcasm that jumped to mind to answer the question that he thought mocked him. He thought to himself, No, I've lain here for 38 years for no good reason. I like being surrounded by the people that you all have forgotten. I like being forgotten myself. No, thank you very much. I think I'll just lie here until I die. All those thoughts went through his mind, but then he bit his tongue and took a chance on honesty. "Sir," he said, "I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred. So someone always jumps ahead of me." The man said, "Stand up, take up your mat, and walk." Still more thoughts raced through his mind, swirling around. Is this some kind of a sick joke? Do you get your jollies out of watching a lame man try to walk? And yet, somewhere, from deep within him, came the instinct to try. The urge came to stand up and walk. So he took up his mat and walked and was promptly arrested. They wanted to know who told him it was okay to carry his mat. And he looked around, and the man who had told him this was gone. He had disappeared into the crowds that waited by the water's edge. So he stammered, I don't know. I don't know. But for the first time in 38 years, he could live as a whole person, a normal person. And they wanted to interrogate him. The injustice of it struck him in that moment. All he wanted to do was to take it all in, to drink in the freedom, because it had been so long. He had waited so long. He wanted it so badly. And after all, it might come back. Grace that came on so instantly could leave just as quickly. He wanted to walk around, be among the people, see his old girlfriend. They wanted to know who told him it was okay to carry his mat. And that's when he told them. Jesus was in the temple, as was his custom, and he was with the leaders entrusted with the right keeping of the law. They were the ones that could tell you what the law demanded of you. If you wanted to know what it takes not to put a foot wrong, they could tell you. And Jesus was with them. And from their perspective, the law had been violated. And from a certain point of view, I suppose their questions could even be seen as valid. Why is he doing such things on the Sabbath? God gave us the law is clear, and besides, this man has waited 38 years. What is a few more hours? This is just breaking the law for the sake of breaking the law. And Jesus answers them, My Father is still working, and so I am still working. And the funny thing is, there are so many other things Jesus could have said in that moment, and he would have been right. There are humanitarian exceptions in the law. If your ox falls into a ditch and it will harm the animal to stay there until the Sabbath is over, you are allowed to get down in the ditch and get your ox out of the ditch. Jesus could have avoided this charge of blasphemy by just taking advantage of one of the loopholes in the law. They were there. And then they wouldn't have to face the questions of working on the Sabbath. But instead he said, my Father is still working, and so I also am working. In other words, this man has waited 38 years, and I will not make him wait one more minute in order to make it easy for someone to misunderstand how God's law works. The leaders had become so hung up on the nuances and subtleties of what behavior was prescribed by the law that without even realizing it, a shift had occurred in their thinking. They had gone from thinking of the law as that which said what humankind could and could not do, or should and should not do, to give witness to the living God, to thinking instead the law said what God could and could not do, and would not do. And the teacher comes along and says instead, I will not wait even a second longer to give the grace of God. You may want me to delay, but not 1 second longer. God is acting now. Have you ever waited by the water's edge? My great-grandfather had only ever heard of a harsh God, and it turned him into a harsh man. His children learned from him of the same harsh God, as he told them that God was waiting to judge them, waiting to smite them for any iniquities. It was so profound an influence that 3 of his 6 children turned around and walked out of the church with no intention of ever coming back. My Uncle Tony walked out of the church instead of being baptized and didn't look back. He had heard enough hellfire and damnation to last him the rest of his life, and he was done with it. Later in life, though, he thought the city of Columbia, South Carolina, wasn't doing enough to care for men experiencing homelessness, so he got involved with the emergency shelter there and eventually chaired its board. It was there that he met a Methodist minister who said to him one day, "You know that cruel God you don't believe in? I don't either." They became friends working in that shelter. They sang in a gospel quartet together. Uncle Tony singing the songs of his childhood, but resisting the words themselves. But slowly, he was inching his way toward a God he was only just discovering as an adult. He was baptized at the age of 67, nearly 38 years after walking out of that church for good. His final years were marked by an abundant belief that the God who had loved him had reached out for him when he was unable to reach back. And so, in response, he should do the same. God's grace is relentless. God is never done working on you, on me, on the world. So if you are waiting by the water's edge today, don't give up. God's grace can change things in an instant, or it may take a lifetime. But as Jesus said, my Father is still working, and I also am working. So we better be too.